Imagine waking up in your small mountain village, and by sunset you're gone, ripped from your family by soldiers of the most powerful empire on earth. You're told it's an honor, but the truth is far darker. Behind the palace gates of Istanbul, boys like you are trained, tested, and broken. This is the hidden world of the Sultan's palace, and the price of survival is your soul. Section 1. The morning the valley changed. The mist rolled low through the valley that morning, folding itself over the earth like a thick wool blanket. It was 1563, and in the small mountain village of Kralovets, 12-year-old Petar was awake before the sun had cleared the ridge. His father, Borislav, was already out by the sheep pen, his broad shoulders hunched against the early chill, adjusting the leather harness on the old mule. Petar's hands stung from the cold as he gathered kindling. From inside their one-room home came the smell of warm bread, yeast, and ash mingling in the air. His mother, Ilyana, was ladling goat's milk into clay mugs, humming an old folk song about the river that ran through the valley. Petar loved these mornings, the quiet before the village awoke, the sound of bells on the sheep echoing softly against the slopes. It was a rhythm he had known his whole life. But that morning, the rhythm was broken. It began as a tremor beneath his feet, a low vibration that grew into a pounding. Hooves. Dozens of them, striking cobblestone with a terrible precision. His father froze mid-motion, his weathered hands tightening on the harness. The color drained from his face. "Inside, Petar," Borislav said sharply. But Petar didn't move. He could see them now, men on horses, cloaked in deep crimson, their saddles gleaming with polished brass. The Ottoman Sultan's collectors. Everyone in Kralovets knew what their arrival meant. Ilyana stepped into the doorway, holding the clay jug she had been using to pour milk. It slipped from her fingers and shattered, the sound slicing through the morning air. She dropped to her knees, whispering prayers under her breath. The horsemen dismounted with the unhurried air of men who feared nothing. One carried a scroll sealed in black wax. Another, wearing a turban wrapped with gold thread, scanned the villagers gathering in the square. His eyes were cold, moving over them as though choosing sheep from a pen. Petar ducked behind a cart, heart pounding. The man with the golden thread turban pointed directly at him. "No!" Ilyana gasped, stumbling forward. "Please, he's my only son!" She spoke in Bulgarian, her voice cracking. The official didn't acknowledge her words. Two soldiers gripped Petar's arms. Borislav stood frozen, jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed in his temple. He knew, as every father knew, that a single act of resistance would bring the entire village to ruin. "Petar!" Ilyana's scream followed him as they dragged him toward the waiting cart. He twisted in their grasp, eyes wide, memorizing her face. The sun had finally risen over the ridge, lighting her tears like glass. They told him he was chosen to serve the empire, to be given the honor of learning in the palace. But as the cart rolled away, all he could hear was his mother's sobbing fading into the distance. He did not yet know it, but he would never set foot in Kralovets again. Section 2. The Road to the Unknown. The cart jolted hard over the uneven road, throwing Petar against the wooden slats. His wrists ached from the rough rope binding them. Around him, 7 other boys sat in silence, each with the wide-eyed look of animals caught in a snare. The smell of damp wool and fear filled the air. Somewhere to his left, a boy whimpered softly until one of the guards barked something in Turkish, silencing him instantly. They traveled for hours before stopping in a larger village, where more boys were loaded into the cart. By nightfall, there were 20 of them, ranging from no older than 9 to perhaps 15. They spoke different tongues, Bulgarian, Greek, Albanian, and most avoided each other's eyes. That night, they camped in a clearing beside a half-frozen stream. The guards built a small fire but kept the boys at a distance, tossing them stale bread and a skin of water, as though feeding livestock. A boy with sandy hair and a bruised cheek sat beside Petar. "Nikola," he whispered in Bulgarian. "Petar," he murmured back. Nikola's voice was low, meant only for him. "My brother tried to run. They cut him down before he reached the tree line." Petar's stomach twisted. "Why are they taking us?" Nicola glanced toward the fire where the guards were laughing. To make us into something we're not. The days blurred into one another. They walked for hours, sometimes in rain that soaked their clothes, sometimes in snow that bit through their boots. At night, they slept on bare ground or in crude barns when the weather grew too harsh. The weakest boys began to falter. A small Greek boy named Leonid collapsed on the 5th day. The guards didn't lift him. They simply moved on, leaving his shivering form in the mud. Petar tried not to look back. By the 2nd week, they crossed into lands Petar had never heard of, the mountains flattening into rolling plains. The wind here smelled different, sharper, carrying the scent of the sea. It was colder at night, and the boys huddled together for warmth despite their differences in language and origin. On the 15th morning, they reached a hilltop. Below, spread out in the pale winter light, was a vast city. Minarets speared the sky, domes gleamed like silver under the sun, and a ribbon of water cut through the heart of it. Istanbul, one of the guards said with quiet pride. The boys stared. For Petar, it was too much to take in. The city seemed endless, a maze of stone and light. Somewhere in its depths, his new life, whatever it was, waited for him. But even then, before he set foot inside, he felt the cold weight of dread settle deeper in his chest. The road wound down toward the city gates, where the cries of merchants, the clatter of hooves, and the scent of spices and roasting meat struck him all at once. The guards did not pause. They led the cart directly toward a set of tall iron gates flanked by men in embroidered robes and curved swords. The gates swung open. Petar crossed the threshold, leaving the world he knew behind forever. Section 3. The Weighing of Boys. The courtyard inside the gates was paved with pale stone that reflected the morning light. Petar blinked against the glare, his legs stiff from the journey. The air here smelled of polished wood, incense, and something faintly metallic. The boys were herded toward a long marble hall, its walls inlaid with tiles of blue and gold that seemed almost too bright to be real. At the far end stood a dais where 3 men sat behind a low table. One wore a robe of deep indigo trimmed with fur. The other 2 were in white turbans so large they seemed to weigh down their heads. The guards barked orders, and the boys lined up. One by one, they were pulled forward to stand before the seated men. A scribe in a red fez took notes as each boy was examined, teeth checked, arms and legs measured, questions asked in Turkish that many could not understand. Those who didn't answer quickly were struck across the face with a thin switch. When it was Petar's turn, a guard shoved him forward. The man in the indigo robe looked him over slowly, his gaze moving from the shape of Petar's jaw to the straightness of his posture. "Name?" the scribe demanded in Turkish. Petar hesitated, then said softly, "Petar." The scribe frowned. "From now on, you are Feridun," the man in indigo said, his accent heavy but his meaning clear. Petar opened his mouth to protest, but the guard's hand on his shoulder tightened like a vice. He swallowed his name. They inspected his hands, callous but nimble from tending sheep. They had him read from a scrap of parchment with strange curling letters. Petar couldn't, and one of the turbaned men made a note. Then they turned him around, murmuring about his height and the clarity of his skin. Finally, the man in indigo nodded toward the left-hand door. "Enderun," he said. Petar didn't know the word, but the guard pushed him toward the door with enough force that he stumbled inside. The room beyond was smaller, quieter. About a dozen boys stood there already, all of them with the same wide, uncertain eyes. Through the window, Petar caught a glimpse of the others, those not sent through this door, being marched away down a different corridor. Some looked relieved, others terrified. An older boy in a simple gray robe entered. He had sharp cheekbones and the calm, watchful eyes of someone who had learned to listen before speaking. "You are chosen," he said in careful Greek, glancing between them. "You will serve in the palace school. You will learn the tongue of the empire. You will forget your old ways." Petar wanted to ask what happened to those who weren't chosen, but something in the boy's steady gaze told him not to. Instead, he nodded, even as a cold knot of fear settled in his stomach. Whatever this Enderun was, it felt less like an honor and more like a gilded cage whose bars he could not yet see. Section 4. The First Night. The gray-robed boy led them through a winding series of corridors, each lined with patterned tiles and lit by oil lamps set into the walls. The further they went, the quieter it became, as if the palace itself was swallowing sound. They arrived at a heavy wooden door. The boy slid it open to reveal a long dormitory. Rows of narrow beds stretched the length of the room, each covered in a thin silk blanket the color of ivory. The air smelled faintly of lavender, though underneath was a trace of something less pleasant, sweat, and the dampness of too many bodies sharing one space. "This is your place now," the boy said. "No one leaves without permission." He pointed to a chest at the foot of each bed. "Your clothing will be taken and replaced. Everything from before, gone." Petar sat on the edge of the bed assigned to him. The mattress was softer than anything he had ever slept on, but it felt wrong, as if comfort here was another kind of trap. That night, after they were given a meal of bread, olives, and a thin soup, the dormitory settled into uneasy silence. Petar lay awake, staring at the carved beams of the ceiling. Around him, he could hear muffled sobs, the rustle of blankets, the occasional creak of footsteps outside the door. Near midnight, the gray-robed boy returned. His name, he told them, was Selim. "You will wake before dawn," he said, voice low so as not to wake those already asleep. "There are rules here. Break them, and you will regret it. Be quick to obey. Do not draw attention unless it is to your advantage. And never, never speak of escape." Petar met his eyes in the flickering lamplight. Selim's gaze was steady, but in its depths was something darker, the kind of knowledge that only came from surviving things one could not speak aloud. When the lamps were finally extinguished, Petar clutched the edge of his blanket and listened. Somewhere in the halls beyond, faint voices murmured in Turkish, and now and then a door creaked open, followed by footsteps that stopped outside the dormitory. Each time, the air in the room seemed to tighten, every boy holding his breath. Petar didn't yet know why. But he would. Soon. Section 5. Lessons in Obedience. At the first toll of the dawn bell, the dormitory erupted into motion. Selim's sharp voice cut through the dim light. "Up! Quickly!" Petar stumbled from bed, still half asleep, and joined the others in splashing cold water over his face from a basin at the far wall. The shock bit into his skin, dragging him fully awake. They were given plain gray robes to wear, each marked with a small embroidered crescent over the chest. Breakfast was eaten in silence: flatbread, a handful of dates, and watered milk. Guards in polished boots patrolled the edges of the hall, their eyes missing nothing. After the meal, the new boys were marched to a smaller courtyard surrounded by arched colonnades. Here, a man in a deep blue kaftan waited. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were sharp as flint. "I am Master Halim," he said in Ottoman Turkish, his voice carrying across the stones. "You will learn my language. You will learn the ways of the Empire. And you will learn them quickly." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over them. "Those who cannot learn will be reassigned." The day's lessons began at once. Turkish phrases were repeated over and over until Petar's throat ached. They practiced numbers and letters drawn on slate boards. Every mistake was met with a rap of Halim's thin cane against the table. In the afternoon, the training shifted. A second instructor, broad-shouldered and silent, drilled them in standing posture, bowing correctly, and the intricate etiquette of serving tea. It was more than just learning, it was conditioning, training their bodies to obey without thought. During a brief break, Petar found himself next to Nikola, the sandy-haired boy from the journey. Nikola's voice was low. "Do you see the ones watching from the balcony?" Petar glanced up. Two older boys leaned against the railing above, their robes finer, their expressions unreadable. "They choose," Nikola said. "Choose what?" Nikola didn't answer. He only shook his head and looked away. That night, when the lamps dimmed, Petar heard the dormitory door creak open. Footsteps crossed the floor. He kept his eyes shut, breath shallow, as they stopped beside a bed 2 rows away. A muffled voice. The rustle of cloth. Then silence, and the footsteps retreating. Selim's warning from the night before came back to him, heavy and cold. In this place, danger didn't always come with raised voices or drawn blades. Sometimes, it came softly, like a shadow slipping through the dark. Section 6. The Invisible Ladder. Days bled into one another, measured by the toll of bells and the shuffle of sandaled feet across marble floors. Petar learned quickly that the palace was not one world, but many stacked atop each other like invisible floors in a tower. Where you stood on that ladder decided everything: how you ate, where you slept, whether you were safe. It became clear first in the dining hall. New boys sat at the far end, served last. Their bread was harder, their dates fewer. Those in the middle ranks, boys with 2 or 3 years in the palace, ate earlier and had bowls of rich lentil stew. At the very top were the chosen pages, who dined in small groups apart from everyone else, their dishes laced with saffron and honey. Selim explained it bluntly one evening, as the new boys gathered around a single candle in the corner of the dormitory. If you are noticed by the right master, you rise. If you are noticed by the wrong one, you fall. Some who rise wish they hadn't. Nicola frowned. Why would rising be bad? Selim's eyes flicked toward the sleeping shapes across the room. Because the higher you go, the closer you are to the hand that feeds and takes. Petar saw it in practice a week later. A boy named Rami, barely older than him, had caught the attention of one of the palace tutors. Overnight, his robe was exchanged for one of finer silk, and he was moved to a smaller, quieter dormitory. The next day, Petar caught sight of him in the courtyard, walking stiffly, his smile too forced. When their eyes met, Rami looked away quickly, as though ashamed. Meanwhile, those who displeased their superiors were not simply punished, they were erased. A Greek boy named Thanos, who had been openly defiant in lessons, failed to appear for morning prayers. His bed was empty, chest gone. No one spoke his name again. One night, while Petar lay awake listening to the slow breathing of the boys around him, Nicola whispered, "We have to survive until we're old enough to leave." Petar didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because a terrible truth had already begun to take root in his mind. In this place, leaving might not be a matter of age, but of permission. And permission was not freely given. Section 7. The First Test. It happened on a rain-heavy afternoon, when the sky over the palace was the color of tarnished silver. Petar had been assigned to carry trays of sweetened sherbet from the kitchens to a receiving room where one of the senior instructors, Master Halim, was hosting guests. The corridor outside the room was silent except for the rhythmic patter of rain on the tiled roof. Petar balanced the tray carefully, stepping over the threshold. Inside, 3 older pages lounged near the far wall. Their robes were richer, their belts inlaid with brass. The one in the center, a boy with sharp black eyes and a face that might have been handsome if not for its perpetual sneer, stepped forward. "You're new," he said in Turkish. Petar kept his head lowered. "Yes, elder brother." That was the address Selim had taught him for senior pages. The boy reached out and took a cup from the tray, sipping slowly. "What's your name?" "Feridun," Petar said, using the name they had given him. The boy smiled faintly. "And before?" Petar hesitated, knowing the trap. "There was no before, elder brother." The boy's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. "Good. You learn fast." He placed the cup back on the tray and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I will have need of you tomorrow evening. After the night call to prayer, wait in the eastern colonnade. Wear clean robes. Do not speak of this to anyone." It was not a request. Petar carried the tray to the table where Master Halim waited, forcing his face into the blank expression the older boys seemed to wear like armor. Inside, his stomach churned. Back in the dormitory, he sat on his bed, staring at the grain of the wood floor. Selim noticed. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Nothing," Petar said, the word tasting like ash. Selim studied him for a moment, then simply said, "Remember, Every choice here has a price. Even obedience. That night, as the rain tapered into silence, Petar lay awake knowing that whatever awaited him in the eastern colonnade would mark a turning point. And in the palace, turning points rarely led towards safety. Section 8. The Eastern Colonnade. The next evening arrived with a wind that rattled the palace shutters. Petar's stomach had been tight all day, every bell chime bringing him closer to the meeting. When the final call to prayer echoed across the courtyards, he rose from his bed, smoothed his robe, and slipped quietly into the corridor. The Eastern Colonnade lay at the far edge of the complex, a long covered walkway open on one side to the gardens. At night, the lanterns along its length cast warm circles of light that dissolved into shadow between the pillars. He found the older boy waiting halfway down. The sneer was gone. In its place was an expression Petar couldn't read. "You came," the boy said softly. Petar bowed his head. "You called, elder brother?" The boy stepped closer, looking him over as if inspecting a piece of fabric. "You're quick. You learn the tongue well for someone so new. That can be useful. But it can also be dangerous." "I wish only to serve," Petar said, repeating the phrase taught to every new boy. The boy's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We'll see. For now, you will deliver a message for me." From inside his sleeve, he produced a folded slip of parchment. "Take this to the laundry mistress in the lower courtyard tomorrow morning. Tell no one. If you're stopped, say you are running an errand for Master Halim. Do not read it." Petar took the paper, feeling its slight weight as though it were made of stone. The boy leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you do this well, I can make things easier for you here. Better food. Less attention." His eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Fail, and you'll wish you had never stepped through the palace gates." With that, he turned and vanished into the shadows between the columns, leaving Petar standing alone in the cold night air. As Petar walked back to the dormitory, the slip of parchment felt like a brand against his skin. He didn't know what was written on it, but he knew this: in the palace, being drawn into another's game was as dangerous as open defiance. The choice wasn't whether to obey. The choice was whether the cost of obedience would come now, or later. Section 9. The Delivery. The next morning, Petar slipped the folded parchment deep into his robe and kept his head down during lessons. Every step toward the lower courtyard felt like walking a narrow bridge over an unseen drop. The laundry mistress, a stout woman with a scarf wrapped tightly around her hair, looked up as he entered. Her eyes darted to the bundle in his hand. Without a word, she took the parchment and tucked it beneath a stack of folded linens. "You're Halim's boy now?" she asked quietly, as though the words themselves were dangerous. Petar shook his head. "No, elder sister. I serve the palace." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned away. "Then you should learn quickly, no one serves the palace. We serve people. And people change." He left before she could say more, but her words followed him like a shadow. That evening, the older boy with sharp black eyes found him in the colonnade again. "Good," he said simply. "You've passed your first test." He pressed a small pouch into Petar's hand. Inside were 2 figs, sweeter than anything he'd tasted since his capture. Petar forced himself to thank him. He even forced himself to eat one of the figs in front of him, though it tasted of nothing but compromise. Later, lying in the dark, he understood something new about survival here. In the palace, every kindness was a leash, and every favor pulled you further into someone's grasp. He thought of his mother's face in the morning light of Kralovets, of the smell of bread baking in their single-room home. Those memories felt smaller now, as though the palace walls were pressing in, shrinking the world until nothing remained but marble corridors and whispered bargains. But he made himself a quiet promise, that whatever name they gave him, whatever tests they set before him, he would keep a part of himself untouched, hidden deep where no one could reach. Because here, in this place where boys became tools and tools were discarded, the only way to truly survive was to remember you were once more than what they made you. And to never, ever let them take that memory away.